Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine stepping into a world where, almost overnight, the idea of a stable, prosperous life wasn't just a distant dream. It became a reality for millions of Americans. After the devastation of World War II, the United States entered an era unlike anything it had experienced before. Factories that once churned out tanks and bombers pivoted to making cars, refrigerators, and new homes. Soldiers returned home, started families, and found unprecedented opportunities awaiting them. This post-war economic boom didn't just lift the economy, it fundamentally reshaped American society, giving birth to what we now think of as the middle class. In this video, we're going to explore the forces that fueled this transformation, the policies, innovations, and cultural shifts that turned a war-torn nation into a land of suburban homes, family cars, and widespread prosperity. We'll uncover how this era changed the American dream forever, and why its legacy still shapes our lives today. When World War II ended, America found itself in a remarkably powerful position. Unlike Europe and Asia, where cities lay in ruins and economies were shattered, the U.S. mainland had escaped the war largely unscathed. Instead of destruction, America had built up enormous industrial strength during the war years. Factories that had been producing tanks, planes, and munitions were easily converted to making consumer goods for a population eager to spend. Meanwhile, more than 16 million American soldiers returned home, bringing with them not only relief at surviving the conflict, but a collective sense of optimism and determination to build a better future. Society was ready to move forward, fueled by hope rather than fear. The GI Bill was far more than a collection of government benefits. It was a profound reshaping of American society. Before World War II, college education had been a privilege, reserved mostly for the wealthy, and homeownership was out of reach for many working-class families. The GI Bill radically democratized both. By covering tuition and living expenses, it allowed millions of veterans to attend college, many of whom were the first in their families to do so. This sudden expansion of higher education created a generation of skilled workers, engineers, teachers, and professionals who would go on to power the post-war economy and innovation boom. At the same time, the GI Bill's home loan guarantees made it possible for veterans to buy houses with little or no down payment and low interest rates. This sparked a massive construction boom, particularly in the suburbs, with developers like William Levitt creating entire communities designed for these new homeowners. These suburbs offered more than just affordable houses. They symbolized security, independence, and the fulfillment of the American dream. Owning a home was no longer just an aspiration, it became an expected milestone of adulthood. The economic impact was equally transformative. By giving veterans the means to start businesses or enter skilled professions, the GI Bill fueled consumer demand, boosted productivity, and expanded the middle class on an unprecedented scale. It shifted America from a society of stark economic divides toward one where a large percentage of the population enjoyed comfort, stability, and the promise of upward mobility. Yet the GI Bill also had limits and exclusions, particularly for Black veterans and other minorities, who often faced discrimination in education, lending, and housing markets. Nonetheless, for millions of Americans, the GI Bill was the bridge between wartime sacrifice and post-war prosperity, reshaping personal dreams and the entire American economy at the same time. It stands today as one of the most important pieces of social legislation in U.S. history, a turning point where opportunity became more widely available than ever before. After the war, the United States experienced an economic explosion unlike anything it had seen before. Industries that had once been geared toward wartime production quickly retooled for a peacetime consumer economy. Factories that had built tanks and airplanes shifted to producing automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, and other consumer goods that Americans had gone without during years of wartime rationing. This sudden availability of products unleashed a powerful wave of pent-up consumer demand. Families wanted to buy cars, furnish homes, and enjoy the comforts of modern living, creating a massive and sustained market for goods and services. At the same time, the growth of suburban areas transformed the American landscape. Developers, like William Levitt, pioneered mass production techniques for home building, creating entire communities, Levitt towns, that offered affordable, uniform housing to returning veterans and their families. These new suburbs were not just about places to live. They symbolized a new vision of American prosperity, complete with backyards, white picket fences, and the promise of a better future. The move to the suburbs also stimulated growth in other industries: construction, retail, education, and healthcare. Sectors all expanded rapidly to meet the needs of these growing communities. The cycle of demand didn't end with housing. Every new home needed furniture, appliances, and cars, leading to even more job creation in manufacturing, sales, and service industries. Supermarkets, shopping malls, schools, and hospitals sprang up across suburban America. Highways were built to connect these new towns to urban centers, fueling the growth of industries like oil, steel, and rubber. The American economy became a dynamic engine of production and consumption, and the sheer scale of job creation meant that more people than ever could afford the products they were helping to build. The post-war boom was far more than just a spike. In economic numbers, it represented a profound cultural and social transformation that rewired the way Americans thought about success, security, and identity. Before World War II, the American dream was often framed around survival, modest success, and personal freedom. But in the years following the war, fueled by rapid industrial expansion and the rise of suburban living, that dream evolved into something more material and structured. Homeownership, steady employment, a car in the driveway, and the ability to provide better opportunities for one's children. The mass movement to the suburbs marked a literal and symbolic shift. Leaving behind the crowded, aging cities, Americans embraced planned communities that promised safety, space, and a sense of belonging. These suburbs offered uniformity and stability at a time when the world had just been through a decade of depression and global conflict. Home ownership, once a distant goal for many, became attainable through accessible mortgage loans, particularly for veterans. Owning a home was not just about shelter, it was a declaration of success, responsibility, and optimism about the future. This suburban ideal also changed the structure of American life. It emphasized the nuclear family, with clear roles for men and women, and it fostered a consumer-driven lifestyle where the accumulation of goods, cars, televisions, household appliances, was seen as a measure of personal achievement. Entire industries flourished to meet the needs and desires of this new way of living, reinforcing economic growth while embedding consumerism deep into the American psyche. Importantly, the post-war boom also hardened the concept of upward mobility into the national consciousness. The belief that hard work and determination would naturally lead to prosperity became a widespread narrative. Yet it's critical to recognize that this opportunity wasn't evenly distributed. While many white Americans benefited from programs like the GI Bill and FHA-backed mortgages, systemic barriers often excluded Black Americans and other minorities, reinforcing segregation and economic inequality even in this new era of abundance. Thus, the post-war expansion did more than just pad bank accounts. It reshaped what Americans aspired to, where they lived, how they measured success, and even how they saw their place in the world. It built the foundation for the middle-class society that dominated the United States through the second half of the 20th century, but it also laid bare the contradictions and exclusions that would fuel social struggles for decades to come. In this way, the post-war boom didn't simply fulfill the American dream, it redefined it, for better and for worse. The growth of the American middle class after World War II wasn't just a spontaneous economic miracle, it was the result of deliberate and far-reaching government policies designed to create stability, opportunity, and prosperity for millions. Central to this was the GI Bill, which offered returning veterans access to higher education, low-interest home loans, and business capital. For the first time in American history, college degrees became attainable for ordinary citizens, not just the elite. This flood of educated workers didn't just transform individual lives. It fueled the rapid development of sectors like engineering, healthcare, education, and technology, driving the economy into new heights. Meanwhile, homeownership skyrocketed as veterans used government-backed mortgages to buy affordable new houses in the suburbs, creating a cycle of investment, spending, and community growth. But the foundations of this prosperity were laid even earlier, during the New Deal era. Policies designed to stabilize the banking system, such as the creation of the FDIC, restored public trust in banks, and encouraged savings and investment. Labor reforms, including protections for collective bargaining and minimum wage laws, empowered workers to demand better wages and conditions. Unions thrived in this environment, helping millions secure salaries and benefits that made middle-class living standards possible. Without these New Deal safeguards, the post-war boom could easily have faltered under the weight of financial instability or labor unrest. Another monumental force in building the middle class was the government's investment in infrastructure. Most notably, the interstate highway system initiated under President Eisenhower. This network of highways didn't just connect cities, it connected people to new suburban homes, opened up markets for businesses, and made travel and commerce more efficient than ever before. The highways fueled the growth of industries like automobile manufacturing, oil, construction, and tourism, creating millions of jobs along the way. Together, these government policies formed a powerful and interconnected system. Education created skilled workers, labor protections gave those workers bargaining power, housing policies allowed them to own homes, and infrastructure tied it all together, expanding the economy's reach and resilience. In many ways, the government acted as a silent partner in the creation of the American dream, setting the stage for private ambition to flourish, but ensuring that the rules of the game were tilted toward broad-based prosperity rather than extreme inequality. The middle class that rose in post-war America was not inevitable. It was built brick by brick through a combination of visionary leadership, public investment, and an underlying belief that democracy worked best when opportunity was widely shared. As economic prosperity took hold, it wasn't just people's bank accounts that changed, it was their very way of life. A new cultural ideal emerged, one that came to define what it meant to be part of the American middle class. At its heart was the image of the nuclear family, a husband who worked a stable job, a wife who stayed home to care for the children, and typically 2 kids living in a comfortable suburban home with a neat front yard. This family model wasn't just a reflection of economic possibility. It was promoted through advertising, television, and even government policy as the pinnacle of American success and stability. The suburban house wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of achievement, a tangible sign that the American dream had been realized. This new middle-class life also gave rise to an entirely new way of thinking about consumer goods and mobility. Car ownership exploded during this period, not just as a convenience, but as a necessity for suburban living. Automobiles became a key part of personal identity and freedom, sparking the birth of a full-blown car culture with drive-in, theaters, fast food restaurants, and sprawling highway systems. Meanwhile, shopping malls sprang up across the country, offering a centralized, climate-controlled experience where families could shop, dine, and socialize all in one place. Consumption wasn't merely about necessity anymore, it became a way of life, a ritual of belonging to the prosperous middle class. Leisure, too, took on a new role. With steady incomes and more predictable working hours, families could afford to spend time and money on recreation. Television became the centerpiece of home entertainment, bringing news, sports, and sitcoms into living rooms and shaping a shared national culture. Sporting events grew into major spectacles, both attended in person and watched from home. Travel, once a luxury reserved for the wealthy, became attainable for ordinary Americans, with the rise of affordable motels, family vacations by car, and later, commercial air travel. This new culture was self-reinforcing. The more people bought into the dream, the more businesses, media, and policymakers catered to it. It created a powerful sense of belonging and optimism, but also a certain conformity, a pressure to live life according to a narrowly defined ideal. Nevertheless, for millions who had lived through the Great Depression and the hardships of war, this cultural shift offered something tangible and deeply reassuring, the promise of stability, security, and the ability to plan for a better future, for themselves and their children. In every suburban lawn, every family road trip, and every evening spent around a television set, the post-war middle class was not just living differently, it was reshaping what it meant to be American. Beneath the shining surface of post-war prosperity, there were deep cracks that revealed a much more complicated reality. While millions of Americans achieved middle-class status during this period, access to the American dream was far from equal. Many groups, especially African Americans, women, and other minorities, faced persistent and systemic barriers that kept them from fully participating in this new era of wealth and opportunity. One of the most glaring examples was housing discrimination. Through practices like redlining, banks and federal agencies systematically denied loans and insurance to people living in predominantly Black neighborhoods, regardless of individual financial standing. Even new suburban developments, like the famous Levittowns, often had restrictive covenants written into their deeds, explicitly prohibiting the sale of homes to African Americans and other minorities. This meant that while white families built wealth through home ownership, often subsidized by government programs, Black families were locked out, forced into segregated urban neighborhoods with fewer opportunities for upward mobility. The result was a racial wealth gap that would grow even wider over the following decades, a painful legacy of exclusion that persists to this day. Women, too, encountered limitations in this new middle-class order. Although many had worked vital jobs during World War II, after the war they were encouraged, and often pressured, to return to the home. Popular culture and advertising glorified the ideal of the full-time housewife, suggesting that a woman's highest calling was to support her husband and raise children in a suburban home. Those who sought careers outside the home faced discrimination, lower pay, and limited professional opportunities. The expectation was clear. Women were to find fulfillment not in personal ambition or economic independence, but in domestic life. While some women embraced this role, others chafed against it, planting the early seeds of the feminist movements that would erupt in later decades. Minorities beyond African Americans also found themselves sidelined. Latino, Asian American, and Native American communities faced their own forms of discrimination in housing, education, and employment. Language barriers, cultural biases, and legal obstacles made it difficult for many to benefit from programs like the GI Bill at the same level as their white counterparts. This dual reality of prosperity and exclusion is a defining characteristic of post-war America. While the economic boom lifted millions into the middle class, the benefits were not universally distributed. For some, the dream of a suburban home, a stable job, and upward mobility became a reality. Yet for others, especially racial minorities and women, the dream was an illusion, with systemic barriers firmly in place. The housing discrimination faced by African Americans, particularly through practices like redlining, served to deepen racial segregation. Not only were they denied access to wealth-building opportunities through homeownership, but they were also forced to live in overcrowded, underdeveloped neighborhoods with fewer resources and opportunities. This created a vicious cycle where generations of Black families were kept from accumulating wealth and achieving the same quality of life as their white counterparts. In essence, while the post-war middle class grew, it was still fundamentally divided along racial lines. Similarly, gender roles during this time were rigid and reinforced by both societal expectations and popular culture. The idealized image of the 1950s housewife, dedicated to raising children and maintaining a home, was the standard to which many women were expected to aspire. Women who wanted to continue working or even pursue careers often found themselves facing discrimination and limited opportunities. This period, though prosperous for many, was marked by restrictive norms that confined women to the domestic sphere. The barriers for other minority groups, including Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, were equally challenging. Discrimination in housing, education, and employment prevented many from accessing the same opportunities that were readily available to white families. These barriers were less visible, but equally damaging, preventing whole communities from fully participating in the post-war economic boom. Despite these obstacles, the inequities of the post-war era laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements and feminist movements that would gain momentum in the 1960s and beyond. African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups began to demand the inclusion that had been denied them, sparking movements that would reshape American society. The struggle for equality, however, would continue well beyond the post-war era, and the fight for civil rights, women's liberation, and economic justice remains a central theme in America's history. The post-war era's promise of the American dream, though realized by many, highlighted the ongoing struggles for others, revealing the deep divides that would challenge the nation's ideals of fairness and equality. These contradictions would fuel the ongoing battles for social justice and serve as a reminder that prosperity, if not inclusive, can create lasting divisions within a society. The history of the middle class in post-WWII America is, therefore, a story not only of wealth and opportunity, but also of exclusion and resistance, a dynamic that would continue to shape the American experience for decades to come. The middle class of the 1950s and 1960s, bolstered by post-war economic prosperity, would go on to shape much of American politics and culture, laying the foundation for a distinctive vision of what it meant to be American. This idealized middle class, characterized by suburban homes, steady jobs, and the pursuit of happiness, became the bedrock of the American dream. However, while the image of this dream was universally celebrated, it was simultaneously exclusionary, setting the stage for the political and social upheavals of the following decades. In the realm of politics, the post-war middle class became a powerful force for political stability and conservatism. The ideal of upward mobility, embodied in the American dream, influenced everything from government policy to election outcomes. Politicians, particularly in the 1950s, capitalized on the middle class's aspirations, presenting themselves as defenders of traditional values and proponents of economic growth. The economic boom, fueled by consumerism and industrial expansion, helped solidify the notion of the United States as the world's economic and military superpower, and it reinforced a sense of national pride and optimism. However, the very stability that the middle class offered also made it resistant to change. This generation of Americans, though reaping the benefits of the post-war economy, often overlooked or dismissed the struggles of those left behind. The focus on economic success and consumer culture contributed to a political climate that emphasized individualism and personal responsibility, which in turn downplayed or ignored the systemic inequalities that continued to affect marginalized groups. The 1950s and 1960s also gave birth to a new narrative, the American Dream narrative, that became ingrained in the nation's identity. This ideal envisioned a world where anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve success through hard work and perseverance. It painted a picture of social mobility that appealed to millions of Americans, especially returning soldiers who had been promised opportunities through the GI Bill. But this vision was a paradox. While it was a beacon of hope for many, it was not an accessible dream for all. As a result, the American dream became an aspiration that reinforced social divisions, creating a stark contrast between those who could access this dream and those who could not. The seeds of future social movements were also sown during this period. While the middle class may have epitomized the economic prosperity of post-war America, its rise also coincided with the growing discontent among those left out of the American dream narrative. For African Americans, the dream of equality and opportunity seemed distant and elusive. The harsh realities of segregation and discrimination led to the civil rights movement, which sought to dismantle institutional racism and fight for racial justice. The 1960s saw the emergence of prominent leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., whose vision of equality and justice would challenge the very foundations of the post-war middle-class dream. Similarly, women, who had been relegated to the role of the ideal housewife, began to demand more opportunities in education, the workforce, and politics. The feminist movement began to gain momentum in the 1960s, as women sought to redefine their roles and assert their independence. Women like Betty Friedan, who authored The Feminine Mystique, challenged the idea that women's fulfillment could be found solely in the domestic sphere. Their calls for equal rights and opportunities for women in education, the workplace, and beyond would help spark the broader second wave of feminism, which sought to reshape societal expectations of women and their place in society. The American dream, once a symbol of hope and upward mobility for the middle class, became the focal point of a larger cultural reckoning. The dream was being questioned from multiple fronts as marginalized groups, African Americans, women, and other minorities, pushed back against the notion that prosperity and equality were accessible only to certain segments of society. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for the social movements of the 1960s and beyond, movements that would forever alter the trajectory of American politics and culture. Thus, the long-term impact of the 1950s and 1960s middle class extends far beyond its material success. The idealized vision of the American dream, while foundational to American identity, also set in motion the questions of who truly had access to that dream. The inequality and exclusion faced by minorities, women, and working-class Americans exposed the limits of the post-war boom, and these limits would lead to some of the most significant social changes in American history. The struggles of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and others throughout the 20th century were direct responses to the contradictions inherent in the post-war ideal of prosperity and equality, contradictions that continue to shape the American narrative to this day. The rise of the middle class after World War II wasn't just the result of luck or happenstance. It was shaped by deliberate decisions, policies, and cultural shifts that intersected to create a new era of opportunity and prosperity for millions of Americans. The GI Bill, government infrastructure projects, industrial growth, and suburbanization combined to make homeownership, education, and upward mobility attainable for a significant portion of the population. It was a period of extraordinary economic growth, but it was also a period of exclusion for many, particularly marginalized groups, whose struggles would eventually spark the civil rights, feminist, and other social movements that challenged the status quo. Today, we can reflect on the lessons from this period, lessons about the importance of accessible education, the value of infrastructure investments, and the necessity of creating policies that encourage social mobility for all. But we also need to ask ourselves, how can we ensure that the prosperity and opportunities of the past aren't just a part of history but a path to the future? What choices, both societal and governmental, will we make today to ensure that prosperity doesn't leave people behind again? The rise of the middle class wasn't an accident. It was the result of intentional efforts that we still feel the effects of today. Now, as we face new challenges and uncertainties, it's up to us to make deliberate choices that will shape the future. What will those choices be, and how will they impact the world we leave for the generations to come?